Hi and welcome everyone. This is a new video series that my colleague John and I are going to be doing called A Cloud Chronicles. And what we're going to do is once about every 2 weeks, we're not promising to commit to that exactly, we're going to walk through a specific Azure service. Today we're going to be discussing Azure Automation. We didn't choose that because it was the first in alphabetical order. I think that would be Azure App Services, but there might be even something in front of that. But we did choose it because it's a service we've had to work with a lot. There have been some kind of recent changes that make it a little bit more interesting. And we're going to talk through that. I'm Joey D'Antoni. I'm a principal cloud architect at DesignMind, and my colleague here is John Morehouse, and I'll let him briefly introduce himself.
Hi, I'm John Morehouse. I'm a principal consultant with Denny Cherry and Associates Consulting. I've been working with Azure for a number of years now, but primarily in the SQL Server data space. And I've been a SQL DBA for I don't know, 20 years now. So yes, I'm showing my age. I know. I know.
Yeah, I've been working with Azure since SQL Azure when it was like in Silverlight. I've been through all three eras of the
Ooh,
portal. The first,
Silverlight. Oh,
yeah, the SQL Azure was Silverlight at first. They had some tool like, and I know the query editor and the portal's still like in preview 10 years later, but they had some tool where you could like query and it was all Silverlight. It was so bad. Um, we've come a long way since then.
well, that's true. That's true.
Azure Automation was actually one of the earlier services. I don't want to say it's one of the first like SQL Azure or Windows Azure were, but there's a long history with this service, and I'd say in recent years it's changed a lot. But for the most part, it's the service itself has been pretty stable. They've just added some features. It's one of those services. The way I like to think about it, it really helps bring together the cloud. And there are a number of services I think of that way, like Logic Apps or Functions and Power Apps that just kind of bring stuff together
I
and
agree.
like fill in gaps. So, John, why have you had to use automation, or why have you and some of your clients maybe, and some of the things you've done with it?
Well, I think that Azure Automation really helps facilitate like an on-premise to a cloud migration because there are some things in the cloud that we can't do identically the same on
Hmm.
premises that we can, I'm sorry, we can't do it the same in the cloud as we do, on the ground. And so like we have used, like in a SQL perspective, we use automation to do like maintenance on Azure SQL databases because we can't run jobs.
Hmm.
And so like we can do other things like scalability. We can scale resources up and down dynamically if we want to. Azure Automation offers a lot of flexibility and versatility in how we can do things in the cloud. Um, you and I are both fans of PowerShell, and thankfully Azure Automation uses PowerShell, so it's a natural way to get some automation into your cloud environment.
Yeah, that's probably a good thing to mention. I have a little slide here that shows kind of an architectural diagram of the way Azure Automation works. Let me get that up on the screen real quick.
For those that
Yeah,
might be allergic to PowerShell,
yeah. I
you
was
have to
going to
learn
say
it.
if you're allergic to PowerShell, automation's going to be a rough time. So just to highlight some stuff here, let me get my pen out.
I will say though, it's gotten easier. Like trying to get the Azure modules installed and maintain all of that. Like that's gotten easier, I think, over time.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that later. One
Yeah.
of the things that Microsoft has changed, you used to have to like install the Azure modules
Yeah.
specifically in your automation account. And there was about a 5 or 6 year period where they broke the way Azure modules got updated. So if you had to update them, you had to not update like the AZ module or earlier the Azure RM module. You had to update each individual module manually. So it would typically happen to us who work with databases a lot. We'd like update AZ accounts, which is how you log in, and then we'd update AZ SQL, and everything else in my account would be like, you know, 3 years old. That's a lot better now. But
It is a
so
lot better.
process automation. So the stated goal, and this slide's mostly from docs, to orchestrate processes using graphical Python and PowerShell runbooks. Graphical runbooks exist. I know they do because when you build a new automation account, there's a demo in that they give you. I've never seen anybody really use them. I know they're pretty limited in functionality, so I've never even bothered to try. And Python, for the most part, I don't know why you do that because mostly people are using Azure Automation to operate on the control plane. John, do you want to explain what a control plane is?
Sure. The control plane is, I view the control plane as the top layer of an Azure environment, meaning that I'm going to use a control plane to manipulate resources in Azure. If we wanted to go for, and again, we're going to talk about databases a lot because we're DBAs by trade, essentially both Joey and I. If we wanted to like reach inside an Azure SQL database, then we are talking about a data plane, which is the layer below the control plane. But we have to create and manage the Azure automation from the control plane, and we can tell it to reach inside something to do it, to do some action that we want.
Yeah, that's a really good description. You can kind of think of it the same way you do as the portal, or if you're not experienced with Azure, but you've worked with VMware, it's almost like being in vCenter where you're not actually logging into the individual
That's a
VMs. But we'll talk more
that's a
about
good one.
VMs later because there's a catch there, and it's good. Uh, but so you have some shared capabilities. There's role-based access control. There's a secure global store for variables and credentials and connections. Don't use it. Uh, Use Key Vault. You can store stuff securely in automation, but just use Key Vault. It's a better practice, and it gets you into the habit of using Key Vault. Um,
Key Vault's awesome.
yeah, Key Vault's a really good store. And if you're on AWS, use Secrets Manager. Don't put secrets in your code. Configuration management. I've seen some folks do this, but not a ton. And likewise, update management. There are just better solutions for those things. That was, I think, kind of in the early days of automation and the early days of Azure. These were really some of the only ways you could do that. Like it gave you a framework to do update management. But now there's Azure Update Manager, which is just way better at doing this. And
Yeah.
you can integrate with all sorts of these things. So you can use Arc, and you can actually run Azure Automation in your own environment against on-prem machines. You can even potentially do that using hybrid automation. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But this is just kind of a neat overview of the service. And mainly you're just orchestrating things in Azure, whether that's doing jobs, whether that's taking backups. And we'll kind of talk through some of those examples as we go through. Um, Let me just stop that share so you're not all, you can stare at us instead of staring at my slides.
Yeah, I haven't seen much using like state configuration, kind of like what you mentioned.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's there was some early use cases for that. This is one of those services that they haven't changed. The changes have been very evolutionary and not revolutionary. It's not like you went away and the service comes back looking completely different. If you used Azure Automation in 2014, you would mostly know how to use it now, and you'd probably be happier with it because the way security is done is a lot better, which we'll talk about here in a bit. But process automation. So let's talk about some of the things I've done with it. I've built some really kind of random things using Azure Automation, and some of these are going to be database centric, some of them are not. One, I have a customer who does have a Azure database as a service product offering that they sell to other customers. It's pretty cool. And we wanted a way to deploy database in a consistent manner and that somebody who wasn't a programmer could do. That was the key point of this. So we could have used an ARM template. We could have used Bicep. I was most comfortable using PowerShell. I got everything to work in PowerShell. It's this really complex, like kind of parent-child runbook because there's some stuff that has to take place after the fact. But we're doing things like adding a firewall rule, enabling diagnostic settings, enabling audit. All that stuff gets configured in the automation. And yeah, you could do that using Bicep, but at the time it was kind of the easiest way to do that. We've also got like stuff where for a big estate like that, you might want to run a query against all of your Azure SQL databases. There's no better way to do that than using automation. Like I think that's something that is kind of nifty. Another thing I did that was rather creative. I have this database that gets log shipped from a vendor. It's this really weird kind of setup, and I made it even weirder. It's about a
Yes, you
15,
did.
it's about a 15 terabyte database, and the customer wanted it backed up, and we had no way to back that up because a log shipping database is in recovery mode, and you can't take a normal backup. So I wrote. Well, this is a good chance to introduce hybrid runbooks. John, tell us about hybrid runbooks, and then we'll come back to the story.
Okay, so hybrid runbooks really facilitates Azure automation to reach inside a virtual machine. So because the runbook, and do we even talk about runbooks?
No, actually, we haven't. I can. Well,
Let's.
keep talking. I'll share my screen.
All right, so a runbook is basically the definition of the automation, right? So Joey's going to bring this up, but it's a PowerShell script, and that PowerShell script is going to do something because it's in the control plane within the portal. if we want it to reach inside, say, a virtual machine, we have to have a what's called a hybrid worker, and that hybrid worker will actually do the work inside the Azure resource itself. So it's now sitting down below the control plane from the Azure Automation. And so we'll take a look at runbooks, and we can show you what a runbook looks like once Joey brings up his portal.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I forget to. I didn't hit the share button. I was navigating. So this is
That's
not
okay.
a hybrid run book. I don't have one handy, but this is
It's a
just a
run
run
book.
book. And like you can see here on lines 4 through 13, all we're doing is connecting to Azure, and we're connecting using a managed identity. We're going to talk about the benefits of that in a little while because that was something that really used to suck about the service.
Yes, it did.
Yeah. So
Run as
then we're just doing some PowerShell. So I actually have 27 commented out here, but I'm resizing a database. And what this runbook actually does, just to show you, it gets all of the data for all of the VMs that are available, at least in my subscription, and then gets the name, CPU, memory, IOPS, and stuff. I have this little app that does this. I ingest this to Bob storage, and then eventually I run another job that kind of takes care of that. But that's just a basic idea of like what you can do using a runbook. It's really any PowerShell you can run at the Azure control plane or on a VM. So back to that hybrid thing, like John mentioned, this stuff is all taking place at the Azure control plane. So it's running kind of
yep.
against Azure resources. With that customer, what I did was because they were because I needed to run that job on their VM. Well, first of all, let's explain. So they have this 15 terabyte database. I can't back it up. So what I had to do was, and this is a pattern that's fairly common in automation, where you'll have nested runbooks. You'll have a parent-child runbook. I had a parent
Yep.
runbook that ran on the VM, and it stopped the SQL Server service. And then actually what it did, and that was fine, so I could take a snapshot of the disk. That went back out to the control plane, but that's okay because I could call that command from that VM. The challenging part was as this data is log shipped, it only ever grows. The vendor never deletes any data from their database. So I also, while we had SQL down, I checked the size of the disk and saw how much space, because this is all taking place inside of the VM, not in automation, which automation normally, if you're not running in hybrid, runs like just on Azure, probably in a container somewhere. So if disk was more than 90%, I then powered down the VM, actually kicked off a child runbook and then powered down the VM from that runbook. And it was messy to do that. It was very Goldberg, but it worked. And that's just an example of like some of the complexities you can get. You can also trigger runbooks, like in the example I showed earlier, that same app. I mean,
So you shut the VM down so you can scale the disk.
yeah. So
Yeah.
because it's V2 storage, we had to power down the VM. We couldn't scale the disk online.
I love me some V2 storage.
Yeah, so let me go to my
I'll talk
logic
about that
app.
later in a different
Yeah,
podcast.
they need to. Hopefully, by the time, well, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see.
So this is an example of a logic app, and this actually ties into that automation job I showed you. So when that job finishes, it writes a file called status, and it just says I am done. When that file gets written, it executes a stored procedure to ingest all that data from Bob storage. And yes, for those of you who really like PowerShell, I could have done this all in all in that automation script, but it's for a demo, so I like doing a bunch of different things. But then once that stored procedure kicks off, we're actually calling another PowerShell, another automation job, which deletes or downsizes the database and then deletes all those files from storage. So this is just a basic example. It's kind of a complex, overly complex workflow, but it's a good example of what you can do to do kind of interesting things in automation and how you can call automation jobs. And for those of you who are allergic to PowerShell and want to write the minimal amount of PowerShell, you can use a logic app and then just call maybe a very narrow automation runbook.
I find it's very flexible. Like you can find different ways to inject automation into things to do things.
Yeah.
Makes my job easier.
So for in terms of scheduling, do you just typically use the scheduler and automation that you associate with a runbook?
I do. Like I had a client that had elastic pools for their Azure SQL database, and like they had a need to scale up for a certain period of time every year.
Hmm.
Their busy season is 6 months out of the year, and so like I created an automation account or a run book to automatically scale their elastic pool up prior to that busy season, and then a schedule to scale it back down. Um, Really took me like 4 or 5 lines of PowerShell to do it in a run book, and so I use the scheduler. Do you do something different?
For the most part, I use the scheduler, but I've seen instances where you want to trigger off some event or like an Azure monitor, and you can trigger runbook
Well, that's a good idea.
based on the launch of that. So, like in your auto scale scenario, you probably wouldn't do that to a database because it takes a while to scale those, and you want to
Right.
scale it in advance. But if it's like a what, and I know there are 100 ways to do this, and this is like an example from 20 years ago. But if you wanted to scale a web server, you could like have a runbook that deployed another web server. In reality, you use scale sets or Kubernetes or
Yeah.
something that had auto scale, but you stuff like that. Uh, if disk automation worked better, that would be a really cool monitor. Like if you could have a automation runbook
That would be
that
cool.
auto scaled disk. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, it's like 3 runbooks to do that, especially if you're using V2 storage. Disk storage in Azure is good, but it's just not very flexible in how it works. So
Not
it's
yet.
not
Not
as
yet.
well suited to automation unless you use UltraDisk, which
Bring
does
your
burn a
checkbook.
hole, which does burn a hole in your pocket.
Yeah. Yeah. Bring me your credit card and or your blank check.
Yeah, yeah,
I'll be
seriously.
happy to put UltraDesk in place for you.
Yeah, I think the some of the other kind of benefits, backups are a really good example. We've talked a lot about SQL database and a lot of PaaS services. It's important to kind of have understanding of, what the backup flow is. Can you restore? Can you take your own backups if you want to? Because sometimes the point in time recovery and the database services are all very good at point in time recovery. So I'm not looking at you, Azure SQL team, but like other services like maybe web apps or something to that effect, you may want to take your own backups periodically before you do a rollout or something, and you can kind of wrap that into automation. I've done a few. One kind of random thing I did for the Pediatric AIDS Foundation was they had a VM that was we like everything we built in their subscription was trying to save money, right? They didn't have a huge budget, so we were trying to save money. Uh, so the VM was powered down most of the time, and it was a SQL server that had like their master data. It had some BI kind of related stuff, but they only used it as reference data during ETL, so that VM typically only got powered up for ETL. So I had a script that would power up the VM uh, and take a backup, call a child runbook that was a hybrid that did a backup on the server using Ola Halgren's code, and then powered it back down. That worked pretty well. So there are a number of different kind of flows like that. Denny, I remember, and I don't know if it still works. I think it's on the DCAC GitHub page. Had one that like had a runbook that ran all the time that just downsized Azure resources. You
Well,
want to run, yeah,
that's a really good example, right? To save costs. Like
yeah,
you and I both know people that have very large, high Azure bills because something went awry and was running forever.
yeah.
uh,
I have a demo script. Let me see if I can find it real quick, and I'll share it if we do. Uh, yeah, it's stop Azure demo.
I
This is
think I
going to
had
bring
something in
us.
place too.
This is going to bring us to an important concept that we're going to talk about that doesn't directly relate to automation, but I think we should maybe do a whole show on called tags. If you're not familiar with tags,
Yes.
tags are very, very important in terms of identifying your bill and also in terms of managing things like this automation stuff. So this is a quick little script, and I need to save my recovery codes again, apparently, according to GitHub. So here, what I'm doing is I'm telling GitHub on line 4, or telling PowerShell to get me all of the resource groups that have a tag with a use equals demo tag on it. So basically, I flag my demos with a use equals demo, uh, and what it does is it does for each resource group get me all the VMs that have a status of running, um, and then loops through them and stops them. And once those are stopped, starting on line 21, I grab the disks for each of those VMs, and then I loop through each of those disks and I change them to premium to standard, which I should probably make this a like, so it just pulls all premium now. Now that we're using premium v2,
That's a good catch.
and then it makes them standard, and standard disk that drops your cost from about $135 a month per terabyte to like $40 a month per terabyte, and it's trivial to do. That happens in the back end. It doesn't like make a copy of your data. And I have a similar one that can do a startup that you could just execute kind of on demand before you're doing a presentation or something.
That's a great script to have, like in a dev test subscription.
Yeah, for sure. Like, and you could go beyond VMs. You could like
Oh,
pause
sure.
anything that could be paused. Uh, that's something to keep in mind. John, do you remember run as accounts? We
I do remember run as accounts, and we are
one of
thankful
the,
for managed identities now.
it's one of the few times I've seen Microsoft actually kill something. Like they're
I'm
like,
glad
no,
they did because it was a
yeah,
pain in the butt.
yeah. Run as accounts were the original way. You kind of authenticated, I guess you would say, with an automation runbook. I want to say they had to be highly privileged. I don't think you could make them like not highly privileged. I can't
I
remember
think you're right.
exactly. Yeah, like it had to be at a pretty high privilege level, which was not good to say the least. Um,
Well,
that
I
went
mean,
back to the early days, and then I think we went through a period where you could do an app registration, where you still had run as accounts, so you could do app registration. Starting about 3 or 4 years ago, Microsoft really started introducing managed identity across the board, and that just works so
absolutely.
much better. John, do you want to talk a little bit more about managed identities?
Sure. Managed identity is just actually assigning a identity through Intra, the artist formerly known as Azure Active Directory, that the service itself then has an identity that it can authenticate against, and then we can grant access to that identity to other resources like an Azure SQL database or a VM or a runbook or I'm sorry, logic app or a function. Um, sorry, the cat in the office was hissing at me. Um, so managed identities, when they started to use that with Azure Automation, it made life a lot easier because it was a pain in the butt to authenticate with a run as account and getting all that permissions hierarchy correct.
Hmm.
Managed identity just made it a lot easier.
Yeah,
That's the way to go,
it's
from
a
a
lot
security perspective.
it's a lot easier to track too, because
That too.
I don't remember. I don't remember exactly, but like I just remember run as accounts being really frustrating until because it used to be, I would say, the best practice was always to run your PowerShell like in your environment before you try to get it into automation. And I still say that's the best practice and you should do it, but I'll be completely honest. I basically write my code in the Azure portal now. Especially if it's something I know what I'm doing. Like if it's something completely new, I'll write it offline. But if something small, I'm usually just resharing code there. So that's made it a lot easier. Um, yeah, so that's pretty straightforward. Logging, Azure Automation, you can log to log analytics. That's probably the best way to do it. One of the weaknesses of the service is there's not an easy way to do monitoring unless you feed it to log analytics. One other thing I wanted
Sure.
to mention that I forgot earlier is pricing. Uh, this is a price per use service. It's not something that's terribly expensive. Like it's never come up with a customer where they've been like, "Wow, our automation bill is really high." But just be aware it is price per use. One of the things that I think some organizations always have challenges with, this is a service that runs kind of publicly on Azure. So if you're running not in a hybrid environment, uh, it's public. So you would have to have like allow Azure services. There's no private link. John, do you want to go into the mechanics of what a hybrid runbook is like what do you have to do to set that up?
Hybrid runbook or
Yeah, a
hybrid
hybrid
endpoint?
hybrid worker group in the automation. It's
Oh, it's been a while.
uh,
I mean, essentially, you have to create the hybrid worker group, and then you have to grant. There wasn't there. You have to install an agent on the VM.
Yeah, it's effectively an
Open.
agent install. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's changed. That's something that's changed a few times. So and I think that's something they're going to de-support soon. So if you have like old hybrid automation, make sure to check it because there's like a new way to do it. It's probably about the third new way to do it since I've been using hybrid workers.
Well, just wait 15 minutes, and Azure will change again at some point in time.
Yeah, one of the other challenges we mentioned earlier was that there used to be like a module issue where you would have to have PowerShell modules. Uh, let me,
I always found that confusing. I'm glad they made it easier now.
yeah,
That they'll do the automatic updates and stuff. I also like that, and I'm sure you'll bring it up when
yeah,
you show it. But like
that's
you could
fine.
do the run times.
Yep. So, by the way, this is a pet peeve of mine on automation. If anybody from the automation team's watching, I'm on a runbook screen. There is no way for me to navigate back to the automation account this belongs to. There should be like
There's no breadcrumbs.
right here it should say automation account. It does not. Hold on. So I'll navigate back through here. And the thing John was talking about is this runtime environments, and this is in preview. Uh, when you build your automation account, you get default environments. You can't modify your default environments, but that is where the Azure Automation uh, or the AZ packages get installed. But here, like I have a demo environment. Uh, Man, this screen is not helpful. Oh, I think it's just being really slow. I
Oh, it's
in
importing.
Yeah. Well, I have packages. I anyway.
You had.
Uh, yeah, I had. I'm sure they would work, but this is where you would import packages. So like, yes, you can say add from gallery, and I did DBA tools yesterday. This package should actually be installed. Let's see if it tells me that it's installed. And
Also, for
no, it
those that
doesn't.
are allergic to PowerShell, DBA Tools is your friend.
Yeah, it means you don't have to write nearly as much PowerShell
Correct.
to do database stuff. But each of these runtime environments can be tied to your runbook, so you can have the specific modules you want, and it makes it just easier. This whole interface is a lot better, and I think you can even kind of automate this. The other
They definitely
aspect
cleaned
of
it up.
this that I was hoping to show you. I know I can't make changes, but can you show me what the? I feel like I'm in the wrong screen or something. Anyway, uh, with these new PowerShell environments, you can run the Azure CLI, which was something that was not available uh, within automation for a long time. The main reasons for the CLI's importance, I know some people really like it, but if you're using a lot of open source things like Postgres and Kubernetes, I've noticed those teams they tend to release CLI commandlets
CLI.
before they release release PowerShell commandlets.
We should do a whole episode on like Cloud Shell,
Yeah,
CLI.
yeah, and like, why doesn't Cloud Shell? Have you ever had Cloud Shell like clear your screen properly? Like it's always I'm having to type clear every three commands.
No,
Yeah, I that's something that's badly broken in Cloud Shell, and
I would agree.
I would like to have a discussion. I always like maybe if I use a different browser and then I use Edge, and it's like nope, it's still
No, no.
overtyped.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
That's we'll have to save that for a future episode
Dear
for
Cloud
sure.
Shell team, make
Fix
make
this.
this make this suck less. Do you have anything else you want to mention about automation before we wrap up?
Uh, no. Well, yes. The only thing that always catches me with automation is the test plane.
Oh yeah.
We kind of we've I know you and I have talked about it many times, and I've asked you because I always forget, and I always have to ask you. But if you are doing Azure Automation, there is a test environment or a test plane that you can test your code. That's not really testing your code; it's actually running your code against
It's
wherever
running
you
your
are.
code through the automation service, straight up.
Yes. So, like, if you start to play around with it, that test button actually is going to do whatever you want it to do. So keep that in mind when you start playing around with Azure Automation.
Yeah,
I always find
this,
that
this
frustrating because I'm always like, oh, it's going to do like a what if in PowerShell. Nope, no,
I
no.
really feel like the service has a fairly steep learning curve, but once you get to the top of the
Hmm.
learning curve, you don't really have anywhere to grow. Once you've done it, like it's just your PowerShell skills. So once you
Yeah,
get
and
there,
yeah,
it's
agreed.
pretty straightforward. So this is a good service if you're trying to learn PowerShell. You're trying to learn Azure PowerShell, maybe more specifically. It's a good service to get started with. Um, you can check out the Azure documentation on this. Please like and subscribe. This is a new channel that we're going to have. And like I said, we're going to be doing probably once every 2 weeks. We're going to be talking about some new Azure, or not new Azure service, but a new to this channel Azure service and describing it inside and out and how it works. Maybe we can do the app service next time. We'll, uh,
And
we'll, we'll
and
keep
we
that in
might have
mind.
surprise guests
And we
like
might have surprise
Cat.
guests. Well, like Kitty. All
Yeah,
right.
that's
Well,
cool.
thanks everyone, and let's
We'll see you on the next one.
yeah, see you on the next one.
All right. Thanks.
Bye.